All right, welcome everyone. If I could ask you to please take your seats. We're going to go ahead and get started here today. If everyone could go ahead and take your seats, thank you very much for bearing with us as the speakers are running from one thing to the next. Busy day, busy week, as we all know. But really great to be back here at the IMF and really great to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily Slater. I'm the Executive Director of the Bretton Woods Committee, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our 2022 International Council Conference. We kicked off our week of events yesterday with some really good sessions online on Zoom on debt and on climate finance. We have more online sessions tomorrow and on Friday that we hope that you can join us for. But today is the main event, and we're very fortunate to have an excellent lineup of speakers for you this afternoon. So just to give you an overview of proceedings, we will kick off today with a conversation with World Bank President David Malpass. He is on his way, should be here any moment. He will be in conversation with our BWC Vice Chair John Lipsky. That will be followed by a conversation with IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, and then we will conclude the program with a conversation between our Chair Bill Dudley and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. We will have no breaks in between these segments, so if you need to step outside, please do so quietly, and if you could, please make sure your cell phones are off. That would be fantastic. There will be some coffee and refreshments outside if you need them. And then following the program, we will have a reception outside in the annex area as well, so we hope that you can all stay and join us for that. A few people that I want to thank while we're waiting on President Malpass is, of course, our hosts here at the IMF. Very much appreciate you opening your facilities, welcoming us. This is a very busy week, and very much appreciate your hospitality. Also want to thank our International Council sponsor, Standard Chartered, for supporting this year's event. I, of course, have to thank my fantastic, hardworking Secretariat team for bringing all of these events this week to life, especially our program team, Elena Tosana and Chuyan Hu. Thank you for all of your hard work. And finally, I have to thank our very dedicated Board of Directors and Advisory Council, especially Chair Bill Dudley, Vice Chair John Lipsky, and Bill Rhodes. Your vision and leadership has really brought a new, renewed sense of purpose and focus to the Bretton Woods Committee, and I think that's reflected in the excellent kind of quality and breadth of events we've been able to put on this week. But it's also enabled us to broaden our focus to new issues as well. So, we're working on climate, we're working on digital. We have a couple new publications on digital that I hope you all have a chance to look at. And it's also enabled us to expand to new geographies. So for those of you who haven't heard, I'm pleased to announce that the Bretton Woods Committee will be hosting a new inaugural flagship conference, Future of Finance Forum, and this will be in Singapore in partnership with the DBS Group. It will be on November 9th on the heels of the Singapore FinTech Festival. So we very much hope to see you all there in Singapore and are very excited to have this new conference. So with that, I am going to turn over the floor and invite World Bank President David Malpass and Vice Chair John Lipsky on stage.
For especially
tall guys.
So, thank you for coming.
Hello, John.
Thank you.
I hope Bill is okay too.
Yes, that's Bill Rhodes, who was supposed to be doing this, had the bad idea of throwing out his back.
Oh, no.
So he is seated.
Good luck.
Hopefully not in too much pain and watching the proceedings. But thank you for taking the time in what is the busiest time of the year for you to spend some time with us today. Away we go, because I know time is tight.
Away.
Let's start by talking about the global economy. It's facing a series, as we know, a series of risks that is both complicated and in some ways unprecedented. How do you perceive these risks, and importantly, are policymakers doing enough of the right things to respond to those risks?
I'm worried about the outlook. That goes into the question of a world recession next year, but it also goes to the issue and the concern that this may be a persistent problem affecting developing countries. So when you think of billions of people in the world living in developing countries, you have to find a system that will work to bring capital to them, to help them rebuild and grow and move forward. So that's the challenge, and I assess it that we right now have a crisis facing development, that the system isn't working. So then we can work back on that. What are the problems? I guess the starting point for my thinking about it is to recognize the magnitude of the change in the advanced economies over the last decade. Since the great financial crisis, there's been a complete redoing of fiscal and monetary policy and regulatory policy through new laws, through new practices, through new concepts. And we're in uncharted territory on each one. The size of the debt to GDP ratios in the advanced economies has gone through the roof. So that means a big drag on the available global capital. You've got the governments being the big recipient of global savings and the big spender of those. So it puts a huge burden on governments to spend effectively, and that's a big challenge. We can wonder about that. On the monetary policy side, it's equally big. I think it's a toss-up, which has been a bigger transformation of the world over the last decade. So we have this unprecedented situation where central banks have excess reserves. Prior to 2009, there were never any excess reserves. They funded the size of the balance sheet with the required reserves, and they bought short-term instruments. So we now have a situation where they have unlimited funding of the balance sheet, and they buy long-term instruments. So that's a gigantic change for the world. My concern is that it misallocates capital, because you end up putting capital into the things that the central banks are buying. If they're the biggest buyer in the world of assets, then I want to know what assets they're going to be putting their money into, and I want to be there first. So the global markets pushed up asset prices, mostly riskless. The highest quality assets went through the roof. Then there was a reach for yield, but it never really got to developing countries. And when it did, our data shows that when the investors were putting money into developing countries, it was into bond instruments. Gross fixed capital formation in the developing world has been very weak. And so that just leaves this gap. So I'll end where I started. We're facing a crisis in development because there's not capital flowing to the people that really need it in order to grow their economies.
So now what? What do we do? What should policymakers be doing in the face of this crisis?
I think we have to be pragmatic. We got here, so how do you back out? One problem is inflation. So that means you've got to do something that gives confidence to markets into the future about inflation. That means raising interest rates from overly low levels. So moving toward neutral is what the world is doing, and there's probably more to go on that. I think you have to directly address this issue on the fiscal side of how do you wind down the government spending in the advanced economies so there's more money available for the world to invest in new businesses. And then on the bond, I think there's, central banks have to use all of their tools in order to address inflation. And that means more attention on production, on the supply side. So if the central banks are just putting money into long-term government bonds, that's really not conducive to adding production into the world economy. So I think that argues for a wind down of the bond positions over time, gradually. I'm trying to be very pragmatic about it, but over time, don't you want an end point where the central banks aren't as engaged in the capital allocation of the world? I think the answer should be yes to that. And that goes to their financial regulatory policy as well. It needs to be more fair and balanced in the world. Right now, they put a high premium on savers putting their money into riskless assets. Well, that's not really the way to get world production and growth going. So I think changes in all those areas are needed.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've for a while been warning us that the constellation of developments in the global economy, especially dominated by the factors from the advanced economies you've been talking about, are particularly prejudicial to many low-income emerging developing economies, especially those that lack either commodity resources or energy. And they seem to be headed, as you've been warning, for debt problems. So far, the response has been, among other things, the common framework. You've suggested that you're not completely pleased with the outcome so far. What has been the source of the problem, and what could we do to make that better?
Yeah, I'll come to that, but let's name the problems that the developing countries are facing.
Please.
Higher interest rates, weakness in their currencies. So as the dollar's gotten stronger, their currencies have gotten weaker, and they're often paying their debt in dollar terms in floating interest rates. We, the World Bank, were able, people don't know it, but in our fiscal year 22, we were able to help $50 billion of developing country debt switch from floating to fixed rate debt. Because the World Bank is a fixed rate borrower, but we lend to developing countries mostly in floating rate debt, which means they're exposed to interest rate increases. We were able to help a chunk of money get out of that, but that still leaves most of the emerging markets in developing world exposed to these interest rate hikes. And then they're also facing the capital outflow as global markets close in London and in New York to the developing countries. That's going on almost week by week right now. So that's the context that we're dealing with. And in the meantime, they had borrowed, developing countries like advanced economies, borrowed heavily during COVID. So we have this confluence of circumstances. All the governments were borrowing as much as they could, and now interest rates are going up. So that's the challenge. Now, the common framework stemmed from, is a G20 product. A difficulty with that is G20 is not really representative of the global financial community, and so it's set up now more on the original concepts, which worked in the 1980s and 1990s, kind of worked. We know how difficult they were. So the world spent 10 years trying to work its way out of the Latin debt crisis, and then another 10 years out of the debt crisis of the 90s, and another 10 years in the highly indebted poor country initiative, the HIPC initiative. These took, and I was involved in all of them, and they were really hard to do. And so now we're facing another challenge like that. And the framework, the principles of the common framework haven't been working for the countries. Only 3 have asked for that treatment because other countries saw that it wasn't working. So we now have Ghana in trouble. Today I heard Nigeria said it was going to look for a debt restructuring, but not under the common framework. That's a signal that the implementation of the common framework isn't working well. I've for a long time been saying it's stalled. So today, the Common Framework process, that's the Official Creditors Committee, OCC, met on Chad, but couldn't make progress on the Memorandum of Understanding on that. Chad's been working for 2 years. The creditors have agreed that there won't be any debt reduction for Chad, but that there will need to be an MOU, and they can't even agree on an MOU. So this is really concerning. On Zambia, they'll meet tomorrow, the technical committee of the OCC, but they were having difficulty today deciding an agenda for the meeting tomorrow. China is part of this. This is the difficulty of France chairs each of the committees and is trying to push it forward under the Paris Club concepts of official creditors sitting down and deciding what to do. But China is not a member of the Paris Club, and the debtor countries don't get to sit at the table, and importantly, the private sector doesn't get to sit at the table. So you've got a narrow group of official creditors meeting tomorrow to decide what to do on Zambia. But Zambia's not there at the table. The private sector creditors are not at the table. And so it means that it's just a very drawn out process that's not working.
And you've been warning that we're going to see more countries with debt problems, debt distress. In a pragmatic way, what could and what can be done, and what can the World Bank do?
I think we should talk about that. So it's very hard within the global system that we're working in for people to say, you know, what we're doing isn't working very well, because it's read as a criticism of something. I've tried to put the context around this, that this is not anyone's fault. This happened the way the world worked. So we need to sit today and say, okay, where do we want to go going forward? So what I've advocated for the common framework to make it more effective, and I do it in conjunction with the IMF, we put it forward to the G7, to the G20, and try to build a consensus around this. The principles are pretty simple and straightforward. One, that all of the creditors sit at the table early on, that you don't have this official creditors separation from the private sector creditors. And a second principle is that the debtor country be allowed to sit at the table early on so that they can express their view about the debt restructuring that they would like to achieve. What are the boundaries for it? So that's pretty straightforward. That's been rejected over and over again as a process. And then I would also like to see, you know this well, the IMF and the World Bank work jointly on a DSA, a debt sustainability analysis for the poorest, as a country, for example, Zambia or Ethiopia or Chad. There's a debt sustainability analysis that's done that is kept secret. Now, there's not a reason for it to be secret. It describes what kind of a debt challenge the country is facing. So I would like to see that be made available to the creditors and the debtor country. Allow the debtor country to see what the IMF and the World Bank are thinking their debt problem is. That could be done early in the process, and that would help speed all the parts. That also has been rejected. I think we should look at all these issues again, and then I'll make, and we have it's a list of changes that could be made to make a more effective debt restructuring process. So I'll name two more. One is that there be an agreement by the world, and that means the creditors, the Paris Club, the process, that comparability of treatment, there should be fair burden sharing among all of the creditors. Right now, it's just that there should be, but I think it needs to be required that as you go into a debt restructuring process, there should be an agreement at the beginning that all of the creditors are going to share in a fair way. That means that if there's a net present value reduction, that all will share in a common way. And that means, and this gets technical, but it's really important to make this work, is that there be a common discount rate that's used for the net present value. You as a private sector creditor shouldn't use a different discount rate that I as an official, or that the official creditors are using. The past practice has been to allow different discount rates and to allow non-comparability of treatment. And so that's how you get into this situation where Chad or many other countries have gone through repeated debt restructurings and never see light at the end of the tunnel where they can get out from under their debt burden.
Wow. Well, so you have a series of potentially pragmatic steps that would make this better, and so far no agreement on them, and more countries coming with debt problems. I hate to say it, your minders over here are threatening that if we don't let you go, they're going to get the hook for me. So, David,
but anything, they'll live. Anything left. I really think this is important for the world to talk about it. I put it on the table at some of the meetings today. This is my 10th meeting today. But we really need to move forward on it now because of those things I said. The interest rates are up, the markets are closing, and the time is right now to try to find a better way through this maze.
Fine.
Thanks.
Then one quick question. A lot of talk about the need to focus the MDBs on global public goods. Does that differ from what the bank and other MDBs are doing now?
It doesn't differ. I fully embrace that. That's a good idea. Secretary Yellen has put that idea out, and others have. And I think we need to, in a concerted way, move toward that. It's easier said than done because your loan is to a country. And so we need to be thinking about grants that help countries improve their global public goods, meaning reduce the things that they're doing that affect others in the world. And that's so I think that's fully part of sustainable development, which is part of the mission of the World Bank. But as it's being expressed, we've got a lot of work to do to really push that forward, and we're on it.
Great. David, thanks so much. And good luck.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thanks. And without further ado, the host, our host here.
Good afternoon.
If there's anyone who needs no introduction in this house, it's the managing director. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to express my gratitude to you and to the whole Bretton Woods Committee. You are such an important force for the two Bretton Woods institutions to continue to improve. And your engagement with us is extremely valuable. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor, a pleasure, and we think the work is important. That is your work, and we want to support it as best we can. Thank you for taking the time. As we all know, this is the busiest time of the year for you, and you've got every minute, every second scheduled. So thanks for taking the time, and I won't try to waste it. Well, let's get right down to business. I very much liked your curtain raiser speech and how you laid out the issues facing the global economy and how from the fund's point of view. One, you emphasize a new level of uncertainty that hasn't been faced before, and I think that's very true. But you focused on stabilization, stabilization of inflation, fiscal policies, especially advanced economies, and supporting the emerging market and developing economies. The question is, are we doing the right thing? Are the authorities in the advanced economies elsewhere doing enough, and are they doing the right thing?
Well, it is indeed a very challenging time. I actually do not remember since the collapse of the former Soviet bloc anything so dramatic impacting our economies. It's a shock upon shock upon shock. And so when we think about how we are handling it, I want to start by saying we should give policymakers credit for what they have done when the pandemic hit in terms of diagnosing the problem and then coming up with monetary and fiscal policy that were appropriate to address this problem. We can criticize ourselves for being not fast enough to provide equitable access to vaccines, but within a short period of time, we managed to prevent what could have been another depression. Since then, we also have seen good steps taken to recover from the COVID-induced crisis. And in the end of 2021, we were looking up to a continuation of the recovery. And then Omicron hit in January. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. And the consequences of these two events are for us to feel. Are policymakers responding appropriately? The answer to this is yes. True, in late 21, many of us, including the economists at the IMF, did not see inflation as the persistent and dangerous factor it proved to be. Why? Because we were believing that now that we have vaccines, the recovery would take off and disruptions will be over. Once we realized that was not the case, then policymakers, central banks in particular, focused on preventing inflation from eroding the prospects for growth, and also from turning into a tax, especially on poor people. And their actions so far have been very appropriate. If you look at just to take the G7, the Fed is tightening, and they will continue to tighten until inflation and interest rates are more at par. ECB is tightening. Europe is in a different situation, so the tightening in ECB is less strong. Canada is actually tightening even more than the US. And Japan, where inflation still is not up to target, is not tightening. They continue with accommodative policy. Now, one can say the job of central bankers is easier because they have a clear mandate of price stability and they're pursuing it. For finance ministers, much more difficult. Mm-hmm. Why? Because their buffers shrank. Many countries have gotten a lot of debt to deal with the COVID crisis, and yet the shock on energy and on food prices is so dramatic that vulnerable households rely on help. Vulnerable businesses, especially SMEs, rely on help. I look at what has been done, and I can say there have been many very rational and appropriate steps, but also that there are just too many of them. It is a bit of multiplicity of actions that could create some cacophony on the policy response side. So we are very much looking to the engagement during these meetings to make sure that finance ministries have a chance to compare notes, talk with each other, look for best practice, what works in particular circumstances, and then we have a more aligned action between among them and with the monetary policy authorities. I'm going to use my favorite phrase. It was in my curtain raiser speech to very simply present monetary and fiscal policy in today's world for everybody but Japan. It is when monetary policy steps on the brakes, fiscal policy should not step on the accelerator. It would be a very dangerous ride. And I see that broadly this message echoes throughout the engagements we have had with policymakers. To finish, central banks quite on top of their agenda. Finance ministries have a hard job to do, but also are striving to do the best they can.
Mm-hmm. Have you just said in a very graceful way that there needs to be more policy cooperation and collaboration?
Yes, there has to be more, and I take responsibility on our shoulders. We have a huge job to do to provide policymakers with a catalog, what are the actions that are being taken in different circumstances, how they can learn from each other, how they can pursue a more coherent and more effective as a result set of policies.
Perhaps a more integrated framework?
More integrated framework, yes.
Very good. Now, one problem in financial markets has been a lot of volatility of exchange rate, and especially extremely strong dollar. Is that a sign of something going wrong in terms of policy coordination?
If you look carefully at the reasons for a strong dollar, they are based on fundamentals. The US economy is strong, but more importantly, the Fed is tightening in a very responsive manner. And that leads to rates in the United States going up and making the US, for these two reasons, safe asset location and positive, well, interest rates that are migrating towards positive, make it more attractive. When the exchange rate goes up because of fundamentals, there isn't that much that countries can do, because they can, of course, they need to follow carefully if there are some deviations due to speculative forces, and then they need to intervene. But beyond that, our general advice to countries is do not waste your reserves to protect your currency if your currency is depreciating as a result of fundamentals. And we actually have seen a number of emerging markets that have been quite proactive to assess the direction that the world economy was taking and increase interest rates before the Fed, that their currencies, and also have strong fundamentals as a result of the structure of their economies, like Brazil, their currencies are appreciating vis-a-vis the dollar, not depreciating. Right. But when your currency is depreciating because of this mismatch of fundamentals, if you throw your reserves to defend it, the only thing that you would get out of it, a weak position for the future.
Indeed. Now, turning to another aspect that you've focused on in your speech, and the fund has focused on, of course, is the effects on developing and emerging economies in this environment, and especially their potential problems with debt. As you may have heard, I spoke about that a bit with David Malpass. From your point of view, how is that going? What needs to be done to make this process, the debt restructuring process, work better, and what can the fund do?
Well, let me start by saying that for many emerging markets in developing countries, this is a particularly difficult time.
Yes.
They're being hit by high energy and food prices, with the exception of those that are exporters.
Yes.
One. Two, they're hit by a strong dollar, with the exception of those who acted early. And three, they're hit by more expensive debt service because interest rates are going up. And that triple hit is really concerning. I can tell you from where I sit, what is the indication that there are difficulties? It's very simple. More demand for fund programs. So let me give you the numbers. Since February 24th, since Russia attacked Ukraine, we got 18 arrangements. Of them, I think 2 or 3 are augmentation of existing programs. The rest are new programs. So it is about $90 billion. Just to put that in a comparison, from March 2020 until now, we have provided about $270 billion in lending. 90 billion is in the last 7 months. And we have about 28 requests. Not all of them will turn into programs, but we have an expanding number of countries that are coming to us. And rightly so. Our role is to be counter-cyclical. So when growth goes down, our availability to our membership goes up. You're asking me a specific question, which is debt. So where are we today? In a dangerous zone, because 25% of emerging markets are at or very near debt distress. They either have no access anymore to markets, or it is prohibitively expensive. This percentage is more than twice, over 60% for low-income countries. And unless we proactively work towards preempting countries going under, we would have more Sri Lankas, more Surinams, more Zambias. We have been, together with the World Bank, and David talked about it, we have been crying for more attention to the debt issue. Doing more than crying, we actually have managed to move the common framework forward, so it delivered for Zambia, it is now delivering for Chad. And I do believe that lessons are going to be drawn out of these cases that would be then applied to other countries that need this treatment. We also are doing something very, very important. We don't talk much about it, but it is very important. It is to introduce collective action clauses in new debt contracts that would protect debtors against shocks, exogenous shocks hitting them, so they can stop paying, they can get into a suspension for a period of time. I am very hopeful that with the support now of more and more of our advanced economies, we would see progress on the common framework. We now have more that are saying, we do need the rules book.
Yes.
2, we need to expand the common framework or the principles of the framework, maybe not the framework itself, to middle-income countries like Sri Lanka, so we have that treatment. During these meetings, in fact, one thing we would be doing later today is to have exactly this conversation on debt and Africa.
Good.
What is happening there, what we can do about countries. But the more you raise, you did a great job with your analysis, the more you raise your voices and put pressure, the better it is. Why it is, you ask me what we do. I mean, we are trying to bring everybody together. We are actually thinking of creating a roundtable format in which the key creditors, the key debtors, and key institutions sit around the table so we can have a common view and a rules book.
In other words, the fund become the convener of this discussion.
The fund, the bank, yes, we create a more systematic approach to discussing these issues with everybody who should be at the table being at the table.
Indeed. In other words, to take advantage of the treaty-based nature of the institutions that gives them legitimacy and allows them to keep operating despite great power conflict. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just kind of did.
I can not. You say that I go not.
But let me ask, we're running short of time. You've had well, first of all, what you just described, I think, was potential use of state contingent debt.
Yes.
That is an interesting, I think, at the Bretton Woods Committee, we felt was an interesting and useful approach to try.
Yes.
Now, there are a couple innovations that you've proposed that have frankly been going slowly. How do you see the prospects? The RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, and the lending of SDRs.
Okay. I don't know why you're using the word slowly, because by Queen Mary's standard, by our institutional standard, it's going like with the speed of light.
Good.
So where are we today? Last year, August, we allocated special drawing rights.
Yeah.
And at that time, we called for this innovation of on-lending SDRs from countries that are in strong position through the fund to countries that need it. Today, we have $73 billion in pledges. Some of these pledges have already materialized with funding in our Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and in the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. On poverty reduction, I can tell you that this on-lending funds what we just announced, the food shock window, for low-income countries. In other words, practical deployment of this money. For the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, from an idea that was in August, from an idea, today we have an operation. 3 countries have already signed staff-level agreements with the fund: Barbados, Costa Rica, and Rwanda. And we have a queue. And actually, the most interesting story is that all countries I talk to say, this is designed for us. I see myself in this product. What is the product? It is 20 years, 20 years maturity, 10 and a half years grace. And it is done with concessional terms because of the SDR on lending capacity. Bhutan, a country that has never had a program with the fund, found out about the RST, and they're saying, oh, this is made for us. So we are now having a conversation even with Bhutan. So to give you comfort, we moved. And I'm actually extremely impressed by the staff of the fund who has made it possible.
Well, that's terrific. I'm afraid our audience is out of time, but as you know, this is an audience that understands the importance of the Bretton Woods institutions, treaty-based, rules-based,
yes,
legitimate multilateral institutions, and we wish you all the very best of luck in these very, very challenging times, and thank you for joining us today and sharing this concerns, but also a practical approach towards making progress.
Thank you very much, John. We are there to serve our members.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
And now I get the hook.
Yes. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce someone who's a good friend, who I've had the opportunity to work with very closely for 11 and a half years at the Fed, and who I've known for many years before that. Her husband, George Akerlof, gave me my only B in graduate school. And I once actually went back to try to collect, but I still have that B on my record. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Janet Yellen.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to meet with the Bretton Woods Committee. I greatly appreciate the committee's work in fostering effective global cooperation at this uncertain time in our world economy. Let me start by saying that we're in the middle of a productive week at the annual meetings. We're making progress on a wide range of difficult issues, from food security to poverty alleviation. We're also positioning the multilateral development banks to better tackle a growing number of global challenges. These include climate change, pandemics, and fragility and conflict. But I want to focus my brief remarks today on the immediate macroeconomic challenges facing the global economy. Specifically, I'll focus on the approach that the major economies are taking to lead the world through this moment. We recognize the difficult and diverse challenges that face the global economy today. Over the past 2 years, we've dealt with the twin disruptions of the pandemic and Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. There have been shortages in key goods and volatility in the prices of food, fuel, and fertilizer. Many of us face inflation that is too high. Some face both high inflation and weakening growth. Others are facing acute stress on their energy supplies. And on net, the IMF is projecting slow growth both this year and next. But my message to you today is simple. This week, the global community is coming together to tackle the urgent challenges that we face. It is our collective priority to put the global economy on surer footing. Our path forward begins with the jobs we have to do at home. I've discussed with my counterparts our assessments on the current global situation, and we've spoken about the decisive actions that each of us are taking to tackle our individual challenges. In the United States, our top economic priority is to bring down inflation while maintaining a strong labor market. Our economy remains resilient in the face of global economic headwinds, bolstered by President Biden's economic plan. But we're highly attuned to the risks on the horizon. Many other major economies are facing high inflation as well. They must also continue implementing policies to rein that in. We will also be attentive to the global repercussions of our policies. Macroeconomic tightening in advanced economies can have international spillovers, and this week provides us with an opportunity to strengthen our communication and coordination. The IMF and other international financial institutions play a critical role in making sure that our economic policies remain globally consistent. We know that developing countries in particular are often most acutely affected by shocks and spillovers. I believe that we must be prepared to help countries that fall into distress. The IMF and multilateral development banks have well-developed tools to help countries calibrate their policies and address those in need. All major bilateral creditors should also meaningfully participate in debt relief to help countries regain their footing. Throughout this week, I've been speaking with leaders from around the world about the way global macroeconomic forces are affecting their countries. We must also continue to advance global solutions to our shared global challenges. Among our top priorities is to work with our partners to mitigate the fallout of Russia's war in Ukraine on energy and food security. The United States and its partners have committed to finalize and implement a cap on the price of Russian oil. And we've coordinated with other countries through the International Energy Agency for the release of oil from emergency reserves. As part of an overall global effort to tackle food insecurity, the United States is committing around $10 billion this year to deliver food to those who are facing starvation and to build longer-term resilience. And we've worked closely with the international financial institutions, and we've asked them to issue and implement an action plan to address food insecurity. Longer term, the Biden administration is also committed to working with our partners to build greater resilience in America and globally to the types of shocks we've seen. And that goal has been at the core of President Biden's economic plan. Let me just give you two examples. First, to strengthen long-term energy security, the United States has enacted the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the most significant domestic action on climate in our history. As we make progress at home, we're also pressing the World Bank and other development banks to raise their climate ambitions while pursuing their existing development priorities. The world's transition to a clean energy future is critical to saving our planet, and it's critical to reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and the autocratic regimes that often control them. Second, we're also modernizing our trade relationships and supply chains to make them more resilient to global shocks. Friendshoring is our approach to advancing trade that's free and fair and also secure. Global trade brings efficiencies. It helps drive down prices, and it supports American workers and consumers. At the same time, we've learned from hard experience that supply chain vulnerabilities can impose heavy costs. We know the cost of Russia's weaponization of trade as a tool of geopolitical coercion, and we must mitigate similar vulnerabilities to countries like China. So we believe it's important to deepen integration with the large number of countries that we can count on, and that includes many emerging markets and developing countries. We also need to build in redundancies in our supply chain to mitigate concentration risks. We're advancing this agenda through forums like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. All in all, the global economy faces significant headwinds, but this is no time to retreat. These moments require leadership. The United States and our partners are determined to move forward decisively and collectively, and together we will shape a better tomorrow. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Madam Treasury Secretary. You talked you mentioned it a bit today, and you developed a little bit more in your speech last week at the Center for Global Development on the need for multilateral development banks to evolve. What's motivating the call for evolution, and in what way do you think they should be going?
So I think what we've seen is that some of the biggest challenges that we face in the world today spill across borders. And I'm thinking of things like pandemics, climate change, the consequences of conflict and fragility. And at the end of the day, a failure to address those or addressing them inadequately really spills back most significantly onto the poorest countries. But I think the World Bank and the multilateral development banks have long had a country-by-country approach to development, financing of individual projects that countries want to do to advance development. And I think to address these challenges requires a different model. And we're exploring with our partners, the shareholders in the World Bank, starting with the World Bank, and with the World Bank leadership, the possibility of trying to design a new vision and way of operation for the World Bank and ultimately all of the multilateral development banks. And I think there are several things that are important. First of all, I think these banks need to have a new vision that it's their mission to deal with global public goods and cross-border challenges. And then I think the incentives for lending need to change because the incentives have been largely what countries want to do to promote development. And here, for example, investments in health security or even in addressing climate change, often the benefits are global. They partly accrue to a country, but the benefits are global. And so looking simply for countries to ask for these investments and find them profitable. And I think that means more concessional financing and support from the banks is relevant. I think this probably requires organizational changes and institutional changes in how the MDBs operate. And I think in a way most importantly and challenging, but also an opportunity, the MDBs Well, I believe they can do more, and we've recently had an important report on this. How can they take their existing capital base and stretch it further?
Leverage it, yes.
Leverage it more. And I think there are some good ideas there that we would like to see pursued in the short term. Also, we just need the scale of the problems, particularly climate change, really requires mobilizing private finance. So
A lot of capital is involved, yes.
we need a lot of lending, we need a lot of capital. And, you know, I think there is a commitment and growing commitment in the financial community to want to participate, to want to lend for green finance. But how to mobilize that capital? Some of that capital is risk averse. And figuring out how to put in place public funds, multilateral funds, donor funds, private funds. It probably needs a new financing model. And we want to challenge, starting with the World Bank, to think about how to really mobilize that private financing.
You have to bring all the big players in. I mean, climate change, if you don't have India and China, you're not going to make a lot of progress.
Well, absolutely. So we need to bring those players in, and there are a lot of interesting things happening. We've started the G7 has begun just energy transition partnerships with a number of countries in which, and India, Indonesia, South Africa are all involved in that, in which countries willing to make ambitious commitments to move away from fossil fuels toward renewables. We're working, a group of partner countries are working to mobilize the finance to make that possible. So, you know, there are a bunch of models for this, but we definitely need to mobilize private capital.
Let's turn to the global macroeconomy. Obviously, what's happening in the United States is the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates quite quickly, dollars appreciating, and this is increasing the strains on low-income countries significantly. In fact, the Bretton Woods Committee, we've been doing a lot of work on the sovereign debt problem, and we think that we're going to have a great deal of difficulty over the next year to 18 months due to the very difficult macro economy. What do you think can be done to sort of help reduce the strains on these low-income countries? What can the multilateral development banks do to help get us through what's going to be a pretty difficult period?
So we certainly agree with you that an increasing number of low-income and even middle-income countries like Sri Lanka are going to face very difficult debt problems and really require debt restructuring. And, we've devised something called the Common Framework that is supposed to be a way to bring Paris Club members, non-Paris Club members, the private lenders all to the table to negotiate debt relief and restructuring. And we've really had high hopes for that. I mean, we started with a standstill on debt repayments, but then feel we need to move into this next phase. And I really have to say that the way it's gone has been very disappointing. First of all, a relatively small number of countries have stepped up and volunteered to have this framework used to help them resolve their problems. But even in those cases where there are processes, they're simply not going well, they're not going speedily. And I think part of the problem is that China is really the most significant lender to many of these countries. And China has simply not been participating in an active way.
They're going on their own way. They've been going on their own way on this.
They've participated in a couple of these, but really haven't helped to bring this to a conclusion. In some cases, they've said that they don't want to participate unless the IMF or the World Bank participate as well. And of course, the design of these institutions was that they're preferred creditors. And it's important, we think, to maintain that status. So that's not something. But, you know, we really call on China to step up. The situation's becoming very serious.
That's a fair point. You talked about friendshoring, and you mentioned some of the ways that you're advancing. How far has that progressed, and where do you see that going over, you know, the next, you know, decade? Because it's obviously going to take some time.
So we've become, I think, both because of the pandemic and then more recently with some of China's actions and certainly Russia's actions in Ukraine, much more concerned about supply chain issues.
Yeah, it increases the urgency, for sure.
So we feel there's a great sense of urgency. And to some extent, we want to make sure that we have domestic capacity. We have 3 important pieces of legislation that have been signed over the last year: the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And all of these have components that are intended to address supply chain issues. I suppose the Inflation Reduction Act, which focuses on climate change, that's most true of. But we want to work with a group of other countries. We have a number of forums, this new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the EU Council that I referred to, where we're talking about specific areas where we feel we have vulnerability. Semiconductors is a case in point. There's only one country in the world that is able to make the most advanced semiconductors, and that's Taiwan.
Right.
And that is a concentration risk that we recognize to be a vulnerability. And so we are working with other countries, and of course the CHIPS Act is intended to promote investment in the United States, but it's a national security vulnerability. You know, and with respect to rare earths or solar panels, you know, these are areas, critical components for electric vehicle batteries, where we have extreme dependence on China and a limited number of countries. You know, we're working with a broad group of partners. So friendshoring is not meant to be a tiny handful of countries. It's not meant to be protectionist. Mm-hmm. It's something that's meant to
Diversity,
get the best of
reduce risk.
Reduce risk, but still get the benefits of trade.
That's fair. Digital finance. So, Bretton Woods Committee, we've initiated a whole new work stream on digital finance that we're going to have a session tomorrow, in fact, where we're publishing 2 new briefs, one on the technology and one on regulation. You know, I think where we come from is on digital finance is we think there's a lot of promise in the technology, a lot of speculation in the assets, and so the question is, how do you encourage the technology, which is quite innovative, but protect the consumers and the investors? So what's the administrations and Treasury departments sort of take? Can you do both? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, to start with, I agree with you on what the objective should be, because there may be benefits from innovation in this area to have a safer, more efficient, fairer, it could promote financial inclusion and a more efficient payment system.
Cross-border payments,
Cross-border.
Trade finance, digital identity. We think there's a number of areas where this technology could turn out to be very important. But you can't,
but
if we have the loss of confidence in the industry, which we've done a lot towards lose confidence in the industry in the last 6 months.
We need an appropriate regulatory
Yeah, we need
framework.
guardrails. We need guardrails.
So, absolutely. So President Biden issued an executive order directing a number of agencies, but with Treasury in the lead, to do a comprehensive analysis of digital assets and the future of money and payments. I mean, one of the issues he asked us to look at was a central bank digital currency, which I think it has its advantages and it has a potential set of problems. But I think we came to the conclusion that it is something that is certainly worth getting involved in developing. We can continue to think about whether it's right to implement, but we should be doing the work. It's a multi-year, large technological exercise and enterprise, and we should begin that and be in a position where we could issue one. But with respect to digital assets more broadly, we've looked at the potential for promoting illicit finance and whether the regulatory framework is working and is adequate there. There is more of a framework to deal with illicit finance than I think many people think. But consumer and investor protection, there really are holes there. There are holes in regulatory authority in some cases for digital assets that are not regarded as securities, but rather as commodities. And we spent, and I convened, because I've been worried about this for some time, I convened the president's working group before this effort to issue a report on stable coins, which I see as, now it's currently relatively small.
But we saw this year how it can go badly wrong too.
Right, we had a live exercise in which the run risk potential for these coins
materialized almost overnight.
Absolutely. I had to go and testify on this topic, and the night before there was a run on one of them which failed, and then Tether essentially proceeded to break the buck. So this is an area where we absolutely need regulation. There are clear financial stability risks, and we would like to work with Congress to try to adopt a regulatory framework that we think's appropriate. But we definitely have holes in the regulatory framework, and we need that for the safe development of these assets.
It's a tough thing to regulate because it's very decentralized and it's global.
And it's global.
And so this comes back to your global goods.
Well, we discuss this and work on this in many different international forums, but
I'm sure the Bank for International Settlements, you've had many conversations about this.
I'm sure you bet. I know there's a ton of work going on there, but it's important work.
Let's turn back to climate change and the transition to clean energy. So if we're really successful in moving to decarbonization, what do you see the long-term consequences as being for trade and for the global economy, and how long does that transition path last, and what are there risks that we need to worry about as we go through that process?
Well, there are a lot of different aspects to that question, but what we agreed to in Paris is to try to achieve net zero by 2050, and the framework's one where each country can announce a nationally determined contribution and figure out the best way that it wants to achieve it. Now, some countries have taken the approach of implementing a carbon tax or the equivalent carbon pricing. But other countries, the United States hasn't taken that approach. We've just passed the Inflation Reduction Act is hugely meaningful. It's close to $400 billion
providing a lot of incentives.
Plan, it provides carrots rather than sticks.
Right.
So some countries are emphasizing sticks more than carrots. Most countries do some blend of those two things. It's very important that all of us take individual country actions to address this. But you asked the question, how does this affect trade? And the problem is, this can really lead to a lot of trade conflicts. And we've recognized that.
Well, cross-border pricing, I mean, what's the price of the thing that you're bringing in?
Yeah, and subsidies create problems of level playing field. If a country enacts a carbon price, a carbon tax, let's say, that disadvantages local producers, and it can also lead to carbon leakage of substituting purchases from countries that produce things in a less environmentally safe way. So it's natural to want to impose things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms to deal with that problem. We do have the problem of when you have countries like the United States that have taken more of a subsidies carrots approach. How do we make sure that these schemes mesh and that we don't end up in trade conflicts? Because it's easy to see how we can end up in trade wars over this. So this is an issue we've been attentive to in the G7 and are working on. We need to expand those discussions, but it will have an impact on global. It will have an impact on global trade, and we need to deal appropriately with those complicated issues.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to the dollar. Dollar as a reserve currency. When you were at the Fed, you couldn't talk about the dollar, but now you're the U.S. Treasury Secretary. But I'm not going to ask you about the valuation of the dollar. I'm going to ask you about the dollar as a reserve currency. We've used sanctions, and I think responsibly in terms of how we use them. But the use of sanctions does create an incentive for people to shy away from using dollars in trade. So how concerned are you about the use of sanctions and that ultimately underpinning the attractiveness of the dollar as a reserve currency? And what can we do to sort of mitigate that risk?
Well, I mean, we certainly value the reserve currency status of the dollar. And it's clear that its role enables sanctions to be more effective. I think sometimes it's appropriate to use sanctions. When we began in the Biden administration, at Treasury, I asked for a review to be done of our sanctions policy to see what works, what doesn't work. Because there's been a tendency, I think, to over-rely on sanctions. And sometimes they can be very effective, and sometimes they're not so effective. So I think we need a whole variety of different tools and not always relying on sanctions that can undermine the reserve role of the dollar. But sanctions tend to be more effective when it's not just the United States that's imposing them, when we have a partnership. And we've been very attentive to that in imposing sanctions on Russia. Now, we've imposed very serious sanctions on Russia, and I certainly thought very hard about this issue when it came to imposing sanctions on Russia's central bank, because central banks hold dollars, key reserve currency. Countries could worry that if by holding dollars.
I might want to diversify my holdings if I feel that's a real risk.
That's right. And on the other hand, Russia has taken actions that violate any reasonable notion of human rights in the UN Charter, and is guilty of horrific atrocities in Ukraine. And we need a way to sanction Russia and to penalize it. Well, we try to incent a different behavior, but to penalize the behavior and help to end the war. So acting with partners in a coalition in a multilateral way to the greatest extent possible, that's central. And I think other countries thinking about would the United States do this to our central bank if we enacted some policy that they don't like, as happens from time to time? Well, no, look, the bar is very, very high.
Yeah.
And to take an action of that level of seriousness, really we would only do when there is very broad-based support among a broad coalition of countries to do it. Hopefully this will be very rare. But you do see countries trying to figure out how to devise alternatives to the dollar, but it's a very valuable tool in imposing sanctions.
So let's turn to something very closely related to the U.S. Treasury market, the deepest and most liquid market in the world. But we've seen, a couple times in the last few years, bits of vulnerability.
We have.
September 2019 and obviously March 2020. I mean, very recently, we've seen the UK struggling with their own
Yes.
gilt market. What do you see as the key issues in terms of the Treasury market functioning well, and what can be done and what should be done to make the Treasury market more resilient going forward?
So we're looking at this with an interagency group that includes your former home, the New York Fed, but a broad range of interested parties. And there are a lot of ideas that have been suggested. The Group of 30 has a report that's put forward.
I participated in that.
And I think a lot of good ideas there. There are, possibilities of central clearing, but it seems like the structure of the Treasury market, the balance sheet capacity of the broker-dealers in a world where their capacity hasn't expanded very much and the supply of treasuries has expanded, that we are worried about a loss of adequate liquidity in the market. And so looking at some of those suggestions, it is a very important market, the world's
Not just for the United
deepest
States.
for the globe.
Yeah, exactly.
It needs to be well functioning, and we want to move carefully, but we continue to look at that. And of course, the Federal Reserve is now set up a standing repo facility that is something that I think can be helpful in providing liquidity.
Yeah, and there's a question, I think, for whether that could be made broader even to provide greater support to the U.S. Treasury market. Well, I'm glad to hear that this is in train. It seems to me that you share the concern that we need to make sure that the U.S. Treasury market stays the deepest and most liquid in the world.
We absolutely share that concern.
So Europe is going to go through a difficult winter, and there's lots of differing opinions about how difficult it's going to be. Obviously, how warm or cold it is this winter is going to be important, as their energy supplies are very much constrained by what's happened in terms of Russia. So what can the U.S. do to help? I mean, are there things that the U.S. can do to minimize the consequences of the energy supply disruption to Europe? Because obviously that has consequences for the global economy, and then that rebounds back to us.
So we're working very closely with Europe, our Department of Energy, and to try to figure out how Europe can address particularly its natural gas needs. Right. Canada is involved in that, and we have but the short-run ability to address it is limited given the shortage of liquid natural gas. The capacity constraints. So regrettably, this winter and next year as well, before new capacity can come online, I think are going to be very difficult. But we're working, and our exports have increased of LNG have increased to Europe as well. We're also concerned about the oil market. The EU has decided that in early December they will cease buying Russian oil. Also going into effect is an EU ban on the provision of services for the transport of maritime oil. And so Russia will be in a position of having to find buyers, other buyers, which may not be such an easy task. That's part of our motivation for proposing a price cap or exception to the services ban that would allow Russia to continue exporting oil and using Western services like insurance, trade finance, shipping, but as long as they charge a price below a to-be-determined cap. So our interest in sanctions right from the outset has been twofold. How to reduce Russia's ability to wage war, which is partly a matter of the revenue they earn from energy sales and other sales, and also through to degrade their ability to run their military regime through export controls and other sanctions on defense and high-tech sectors, and also to protect the global economy from the consequences of the war, which means trying to hold down energy prices, food prices as well, to the maximum extent possible. And we see the combination of the ban that Europe is going to enact with a price cap that continues to let that oil flow, but limits, maintains a high enough price that it's profitable for Russia to sell the oil rather than to shut it in.
Right.
But a lower, a price that's low enough to also reduce their revenues. We see that as helpful for the energy situation this year and going forward.
How do you discover what that price is?
Well, we're working on it and discussing it with.
I would think that'd be quite difficult.
Well, we know that that Russia has long, been willing and profitably sold oil at an average price of in the 60s, I think, over the last 5-7 years, something like that. So certainly a price in that range would be, sufficient to feel Russia could profitably produce and sell. And Russia's cost is really pretty low. So we haven't determined the price, and we're working with our partners to decide what it should be. But the objective is to protect the globe from the consequences of a further spike in oil prices.
Right. Let's turn back to the governance of the global economy. There's a lot of people, including the Bretton Woods Committee, that are going to be looking at this whole issue of global governance. And what are your thoughts on that in terms of, do we have the right institutions with the right mandate, with the right governance structure? I mean, it's a big question, but what are your thoughts?
So
this is your last question.
That's a hard question. No comment. Well, we've already talked about the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, and I think promoting the provision of finance to countries that don't, for investment needs, have good access is an area where we clearly need reform and dealing with global public goods. So that's very high on our agenda. I think the G20 continues to be a group that works successfully together, although the situation with China and Russia has made it more difficult for that group to function. But that said, we continue to have very productive meetings, and the G20, for example, last year sponsored and supported the development of a new finance and health ministers task force and the setting up of a financial intermediary fund at the World Bank to deal with pandemics in line with the reports of an experts group. So, we're making progress. The G20 does address issues. We're addressing sustainable finance issues in the context of the G20 and food security. The G7, is a core group that functions well, and so you may have larger thoughts on governance, but I'll stop
I
with those.
think you have plenty of good thoughts on governance, Madam Secretary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill. Pleasure. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Madam Treasury Secretary. Thank you all for coming today. Obviously, a terrific set of speakers. Thank you, John Lipsky, for moderating twice as much as I did. I want to just talk about a few things before we adjourn. First, I want to thank the IMF for hosting us here today. Absolutely terrific to be back here together again in person. That's wonderful. I want to obviously thank the three speakers, Janet Yellen, Kristalina Georgieva, and David Malpass. So thank you for participating today. I want to also thank Standard Charter for being our sponsor, corporate sponsor for all the International Council events this week. The Bretton Woods Committee isn't done yet. We have some more events coming up tomorrow and the next day. Tomorrow it's going to be on digital finance. We're doing a lot of, I think, really interesting work there, which I think is very germane to some of the things that the Treasury Secretary and I were talking about. And we're broadening our wings globally. We're having a conference in Singapore, sponsored by DBS Bank, the biggest bank in Singapore, on digital finance in early November. So I expect everyone here just to fly out to Singapore and join us. It's really not that far. Very pleasant trip. So with that, thank you very much.